A wounded railroad tycoon left for dead after a robbery collapses at the fence of a grieving widow's struggling ranch. She drags him inside, expecting only to keep him alive, not to rebuild her broken family, her dying land, and her own shattered heart. But as the orchard blooms again and her children laugh under skies once heavy with sorrow, a new legacy takes root. This isn't just a story of survival, it's a story of choosing to stay, to love, and to build something that lasts forever. Are you ready to witness it? The wind came low and mean across the plains that morning, dry and full of grit, as if the land itself had grown tired of waiting for rain. Anna Thatcher stood on the front steps of the old homestead, her arms wrapped tight around herself despite the early heat. The boards beneath her bare feet were warm already, sun-baked and splintering, just like everything else she owned. Her eyes traced the edge of the pasture, then the barn, then the broken fence beyond it. Nothing was whole. Not the land, not the house, not her heart. A year had passed since Jacob died. He'd gone out before dawn one morning to check on the mare that had taken a bad fall. The horse lived. Jacob didn't, and a timber snapped in the barn roof, and he never had the chance to shout. Just gone, like the wind had taken him. Anna hadn't cried when she buried him, not in front of the children, not with the preacher standing over his pine box speaking of heaven and hardship like they were one and the same. She'd cried later, in the dark, with the pillow pulled over her face, and Jacob's coat clutched to her chest. Now it was just her and the children. Emily, 10, already taller than most her age, already knowing too much about how the world could hurt. Henry, 7, soft-eyed and quiet, still asking when Papa would come home, even though he knew the answer. They had weathered the first winter alone, patching the roof, mending the fence, taking in sewing from neighbors too busy to do it themselves. But spring had brought more trouble. The creek dried up early. The hens laid less. The wheat was sparse, yellow, before it was tall. The ranch, once something Jacob had spoken of with pride, had become a weight and a drag behind her like a broken yoke. She stepped down off the porch and walked toward the barn, squinting against the wind. Emily was already there, feeding the goats. Henry followed behind, clutching his little tin pail of oats like a treasure. The two of them worked without complaint, without waiting to be asked. Anna watched them for a long moment, her throat tight. "Mama," Emily called, "there's something out by the south fence." Anna turned. "What kind of something?" "I don't know." Emily shaded her eyes. "Looks like a person." Anna's heart stilled. She strode quickly across the field, boots crunching through the brittle grass. As she neared the fence, she saw it, something slumped at the base of a cottonwood tree, motionless. She broke into a run. It was a man. His clothes were fine beneath the dirt. What remained of a dark suit, torn and blood-stained. His boots were expensive, hand-stitched, one half off his foot. A gold watch glinted faintly in the sunlight, still pinned to a torn vest. His face was swollen, bruised, a gash split across his brow. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and fast. Anna knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. Alive. She looked around. No horse, no wagon, no tracks but his. Henry appeared at her side, eyes wide. "Is he dead?" "No," Anna said, "but close." They dragged him back across the field, Emily holding his legs while Anna and Henry heaved at his arms. It took the better part of an hour to get him into the house and laid out on Jacob's old bed. Emily fetched water. Henry brought clean rags. Anna cleaned the wound on his head and stitched it with shaking hands. The cut on his leg was worse, a clean bullet wound, gone through the thigh. She packed it with poultices, whispering the prayers her mother had taught her when nothing else would do. He didn't wake that night. Anna sat beside the bed, arms crossed tight, watching the rise and fall of his chest. She didn't sleep, couldn't. In the morning he opened his eyes. They were blue, deep, sharp, like a sky about to break open. He looked at her for a long time before trying to speak. "Water?" he croaked. She held a cup to his lips. He drank, swallowed. Where? You're on my land, she said. South fence. Found you half dead. His brow furrowed. Train. She leaned forward. There was a train robbery last week, north of Junction. You come from there? He didn't answer. You shot? He nodded slowly. Didn't see them coming. You with the railroad? He hesitated. Then, I was. She looked at his watch, the silver fob still gleaming, the initials etched into the back. WPR, West Pacific Rail. A name came back to her, half remembered from newspapers Jacob used to read aloud. A man from Chicago, big money, bigger dreams, something about a line that would stretch clear to the Rockies. You're Everett Bishop, she said softly. His eyes didn't move, didn't blink. Thought you were dead. I was close. She stood. Rest. You've got healing to do. He stayed quiet. Days passed. Everett didn't ask to leave. Anna didn't ask why he was really there. The children took to him quicker than she expected. Emily brought books and read to him in the afternoons. Henry showed him his drawings, wagons, animals, a house with a roof that didn't leak. Everett listened, always listened. He began to walk, first to the window, then the porch. His limp was bad, but he bore it without complaint. He asked about the ranch, about Jacob, about the dried-up creek and the roof they'd patched with tar and old sheet metal. Anna answered in short sentences, never giving more than she had to, but he noticed everything. One morning she found him in the barn, mending a broken hinge on the goat pen. You shouldn't be on that leg, she said. He straightened slowly, leaning on the post. I can't just lie in your house and take. Let me earn my keep. You're not my concern. He met her eyes. No, but you took me in anyway. She didn't respond. He stayed. 1 week turned into 2, then a month. He repaired the back steps, cleaned out the barn loft, reinforced the fence line with what little wood they had left. He didn't speak much of his life before, just that he'd grown up in Illinois, that the railroad had been everything, that he'd spent more nights in train cars than in beds. Don't you want to go back? Anna asked one evening as they watched the children chase fireflies in the dusk. He was quiet for a long time. No one's looking for me anymore, he said. And even if they were, I don't think I'm the man I was. She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't. The children came inside, breathless and laughing. Henry climbed into Everett's lap without hesitation. You going to stay, Mr. Everett? Everett looked at Anna. She didn't stop him. If your mama'll let me, he said. Henry grinned. That night, Anna stood at the sink, scrubbing plates with water gone tepid. Everett came to stand beside her, drying with a rag. You've got good kids, he said. They've had to be. He nodded. They'll be all right. They better be. This land's all we've got. Not anymore, he said quietly. She looked at him, the dish slipping beneath the water. What do you mean? He took a folded paper from his coat, opened it. A deed, a title, her name written in ink, already notarized. What is this? Back taxes, loans, I paid them off. Her voice rose. You had no right. I had the money, I don't anymore. I don't need charity. This isn't charity, he said. This is investment. In what? In you. Silence filled the kitchen. Finally she asked, Why? He met her gaze. Because you opened the door. She didn't speak the rest of the night. Not as they tucked the children in, not as she banked the fire, not as Everett limped out onto the porch to sit under the stars. She sat beside him anyway, her arms folded tight, jaw set, heart racing too loud in her chest. He didn't try to fill the silence. He just sat, breathing in the night air, eyes on the horizon where the prairie rolled away into black. I don't know how to owe someone, she said finally. You don't. You think I've got something to give a man like you? I think you already gave it. He turned to her, slow and steady. You gave me breath when I couldn't find it. You gave me a roof, food, your children's trust. You gave me time to remember I wanted to live." She looked down at her hands. "I didn't ask for anything back." "You didn't have to." He reached into his coat again and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. Maps, plans, sketches. Anna leaned closer, the edge of her shoulder brushing his. "What is this?" "Water," he said. "There's a spring just past the old North Ridge. We could dig a line. It'd feed the garden, the animals. Maybe enough for wheat again." "We?" "You gave me a place to heal," he said. "I'd like to help you build it back." The next day he and Caleb, who now followed Everett like a shadow, took the wagon north, tracing the ridge line, stopping to test soil and dig. They returned with wet hands and mud-caked boots. Everett marked the spot on the map. "We start here." And they did. The digging took weeks. Emily and Henry helped haul rock. Anna worked by Everett's side every day, her hands blistered, her back aching, but her heart starting to beat in a rhythm she hadn't felt since before Jacob died. Neighbors began to stop by. First the Parkers from 2 miles east, then the Ramos brothers, then old Mr. Stillman, who hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 years. They brought seed, chickens, spare nails. Everett greeted each one with respect and quiet gratitude. He never mentioned his name, never told them who he'd been. He was just Everett now, the man who helped repair fences, the man who helped Anna laugh again. The water came like a miracle, cold, clear, steady. They rerouted a line to the troughs and another to the garden. The crops began to rise taller, the hens laid fuller, the cattle, thin from drought, began to put on weight again. By the end of summer, the ranch no longer looked like something clinging to survival. It looked like home. Anna found herself smiling more, singing while she kneaded dough, holding Everett's gaze a second longer than she used to. One night she made peach cobbler with the last of the cellar jars. They sat on the porch, passing a bowl between them, the children asleep inside. "You always dream of this?" she asked. "No," he said. "I used to think money was the dream." "And now?" He looked out over the fields, the barn, the moonlit fence line. "This," he said, "right here." Weeks turned into months. The first snow fell light and clean, dusting the roof and the pasture. Everett chopped wood while Anna patched quilts by the fire. Emily read to Henry while the wind howled outside. When Everett caught the fever in January, Anna didn't sleep. She stayed by his side, pressing cloths to his forehead, whispering prayers she hadn't said aloud in years. He tossed and turned, muttering names she didn't recognize, reliving battles from boardrooms and train lines, not battlefields. "I never wanted it to be like that," he said one night, half lost to the fever. "I just wanted to build something that lasted." "You are," she whispered. "You are." When the fever broke, he wept, not from pain, but from relief. Spring came late but bright. The garden burst with new life. The wheat rose thick and green. The barn stood strong. The creek ran full. One morning, Everett handed Anna a small box. Inside was a ring, not new, not gold, just iron, worked smooth, shaped by hand. "I don't have land to give you," he said. "You already have that. I don't have promises to make you that haven't already been lived." She looked at the ring, then at the man who had gone from stranger to partner to something she couldn't imagine losing. "I'm not the same woman Jacob married," she said. "I'm not the man I was when I fell into your field," he said. She slid the ring onto her finger. "Then maybe we're exactly right for each other now." They married under the cottonwood tree by the south fence. Emily wore flowers in her hair. Henry carried the ring. The neighbors came in wagons and on horseback. They brought pies and bread, quilts, and hand-carved gifts. Someone played a fiddle. Someone else passed around sweet cider. And as Anna and Everett stood together beneath the same tree where she'd found him bleeding, they spoke words not of new beginnings, but of rebuilt lives, of love earned and love chosen. After the last guest left and the children were asleep, they stood on the porch holding hands. "You ever think we'd end up here?" Anna asked. "I hoped." "You never said." "I didn't want to hope out loud, not until you were ready." She leaned against him. "I was ready the day you stayed." And he did. Always. Summer returned with heavy skies and long rains, the kind that soaked deep into the soil and made everything grow too fast to keep up with. The wheat field rose thick and tall, the stalks brushing Anna's hips as she walked the rows at dusk, Everett just behind her, his hand grazing hers with every step. Henry ran ahead chasing a stray hen, his laughter carrying across the field. Emily sat beneath the cottonwood tree with a book open on her lap, her braids slipping loose as she read. The ranch no longer looked worn out or forgotten. The barn had been painted red, its roof sealed tight against the weather. The chicken coop had been rebuilt. The goat pen doubled in size. A new pump house stood by the creek, turning river water into something that filled their troughs and watered their fields. The old root cellar had been dug deeper, lined with shelves that held jars of beans and peaches, tomatoes and jams. The garden grew wild in its order, rows of corn, squash, and carrots planted by Everett's hand and weeded by the children's. Anna's flower beds wrapped around the house now, full of color, a softness that had come back to her with the seasons. Everett kept a new ledger. Not for train schedules or land acquisitions or rail company holdings, but for things like livestock counts, crop yields, and what month the fence on the north side needed replacing. Anna teased him for it, but he smiled every time he opened it, tracing the numbers like they were something sacred. One morning she found him in the barn, carving names into a new beam near the loft. "What's this?" she asked, brushing sawdust from her skirt. Mark," he said, "for everything this place has become, for Jacob, for the children, for you." He handed her the knife. "Put yours beside mine." She hesitated, then took it and carved her name slowly just beneath his. When she stepped back, she saw what he had written above them both. Home. The word sat solid and certain in the wood, deeper than any title, more lasting than any deed. Emily grew taller that summer, and quieter. She spent more time writing, sketching, sitting on the porch late into the night with Everett, asking him about the trains and the cities he'd left behind. She asked about maps and steel and the weight of what men carried when they tried to build too much, too fast. Henry kept a pet rooster named Pike and built it a cart out of scrap wood and wagon wheels. He painted it red and hitched the bird up every afternoon, parading it around the house like royalty. Everett pretended not to be amused, but every evening he slipped the boy a peppermint and said, "That's the best wagon team I've seen in years." Anna watched them all from the window sometimes, her hands in bread dough, her apron dusted with flour. She didn't speak much about the past any more, not to the children, not even to Everett. But he knew. He knew the weight she had carried and the cracks in her that hadn't quite healed. He didn't try to fix them. He just stood beside her, walked with her, held her hand when the wind changed. They spent the fall preparing for the cold, chopping wood, packing the cellar, sewing new clothes. Everett taught Henry how to sharpen an axe. He taught Emily how to change a wagon wheel. He taught Anna how to rest, how to sit and drink coffee on the porch without counting the chores waiting behind her. And when the snow finally came, quiet and thick and full, they sat together by the fire with blankets pulled to their chins and mugs of cider in their hands. "You ever miss it?" Anna asked, watching the flames. "Miss what?" "The rails, the power, the name." He took a long sip, then shook his head. "No, I miss this. I just didn't know it yet." She leaned into him. "I'm glad you stayed. I didn't have anywhere better to be." Winter passed with laughter and quiet. The children played cards on the rug. Anna baked through storms. Everett built birdhouses in the barn and read old railroad journals like they were fairy tales. When spring came again, brighter than any they'd seen yet, Everett planted 2 peach trees at the edge of the field. "For what's to come," he said. They bloomed the second year, pale pink and stubborn against the sky. Anna stood beneath them one morning, her hand resting on her belly. Everett found her there, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, dirt on his boots. "You think we've got room for one more?" She smiled. "We made this land hold us. I think it'll hold more." He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I'm not the man I was." "I know," she said, "and I'm not trying to replace him." "You're not. You're building what he couldn't finish. With me." They stood there as the wind stirred the blossoms above them. Neither one spoke. They didn't need to. The trees were blooming. The earth was soft. The house was warm. The children were safe. And in every corner of the life they'd rebuilt, love lived. Quiet, sure, earned forever. The baby came in the fall, just as the wheat had been harvested, and the last apples were gathered into crates. It was a long labor, drawn out through a night that smelled of smoke and wet earth, thunder murmuring low in the distance. Anna gripped Everett's hand with such force he thought she might break it, but he didn't flinch. He stayed by her side, wiping her brow, whispering steady words until the moment their daughter's first cry rang out over the fields. They named her Clara. She had Everett's eyes and Anna's hands. Emily wept when she first held her, the baby's tiny fingers curling around her thumb. Henry declared he'd build her a toy wagon and began collecting scraps the very next morning. Everett carved her name into the beam beside his and Anna's, deep and neat, as if she had always been there. The house filled with warmth that winter. Clara's crib sat beside the hearth, where she slept bundled in quilts sewn from Anna's old dresses. Emily read aloud to her each evening, her voice soft and sure. Henry took to singing lullabies, off-key but full of heart. Everett built a new rocking chair, where Anna sat every evening with Clara asleep on her chest. He didn't return to business, didn't wire back east, didn't speak of trains or titles anymore. He spent his days mending harnesses, fixing fence posts, drawing out new plans for a schoolhouse that could serve the nearby families. Anna watched him in the quiet hours, when he thought no one saw, standing by the window with Clara in his arms, swaying gently as he stared out over the land. He had changed, but not just because of the wound, or the time, or the work. He had changed because he had chosen to. One evening, as the last snow melted into the fields and the air smelled like rain and straw, Anna found him in the barn, fitting new shoes to one of the mares. "You never said why you were out here that day," she said, her voice calm. He didn't look up. "I was supposed to be on that train." She stepped closer. "The one that got robbed?" He nodded. "But I got off early. I didn't like the company I was keeping." She leaned against the stall door. "What were you running from?" He paused, then straightened slowly. "Myself." "And now?" He turned to her, brushing his hands clean. "Now I'm not running. I'm here, with you, with them, with this." He walked to her, took her hand. "I think this is what I was always meant to build. I just didn't know how, until you showed me." They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. Outside, the first green tips pushed through the thawed earth. The garden waited. The orchard slept. And inside, by the fire, the baby dreamed, wrapped in the scent of cinnamon and cedar and love that had been made not quickly, not easily, but fully. Spring brought new growth. The peach trees bloomed again. The wheat stretched higher than ever before. And every morning, as the sun crested the ridge, Anna and Everett stood on the porch, their children gathered near, watching the light spill across the ranch that had once been broken. Now mended, now whole, now home. The peach trees bore fruit that summer, small at first, firm and blushing pink, but sweet enough to make Henry's eyes widen when he bit into one, juice running down his chin. Emily gathered baskets full, lining them with cotton cloth and setting them by the windowsill to ripen. Everett built a drying rack so they could save some for winter. Clara took her first steps between the trees, barefoot, her laugh ringing through the orchard as she wobbled into Anna's arms. The ranch hummed with life. It was no longer a place that merely endured, it thrived. Chickens clucked in the yard. The goats had twins in the spring. Everett had purchased 2 new mares from a rancher west of the ridge, fine animals with bright eyes and proud necks. He named them Rose and Violet, after the colors Clara had started saying when she pointed to Anna's garden. Anna planted wildflowers along the fence line, not just for the beauty, but for the bees. The honey that season was thick and golden, and when she spooned it over biscuits fresh from the oven, Everett closed his eyes like it was something sacred. He said less now, but when he spoke his words were deeper, earned. Sometimes all he did was reach for her hand across the table, squeeze once, and smile. One hot August afternoon a rider came up the drive. He was dressed like a city man, clean boots, pressed coat, eyes that flicked too fast from one thing to another. Everett stepped off the porch before the man even dismounted. "You're a hard man to find," the rider said. "I'm not hiding," Everett answered. Anna stood in the doorway, Clara on her hip, Emily and Henry peering from the window. The man handed Everett a telegram. Everett didn't read it right away. He folded it in half and slipped it into his vest. "I'm not coming back," he said simply. "They're offering you the entire southern line. Your name would be on the stock, on the maps. You walk away from this and they'll replace you." "They already did," Everett said. "I just didn't know it at the time." The man opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked toward the house, toward the orchard, toward the barn and the field. "This is your legacy now?" Everett looked back at Anna. "It's the only one that matters." The man didn't argue. He tipped his hat and rode away. That night Everett sat on the porch with Anna, the children asleep inside. He handed her the telegram without a word. She read it slowly, then refolded it. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "No," he said, "not for a second." They watched the fireflies rise from the wheat, the stars spill across the sky. "There was a time I thought I'd die without ever being known," Everett said. "I had money, reach, control, but no one who really saw me. Then I landed in your field." "And you stayed," she whispered. He took her hand and kissed her knuckles. "That's the only thing I ever got right on the first try." The seasons kept turning. Emily left home to study medicine, but came back every summer to help harvest and sit beside her mother in the garden. Henry built a workshop near the barn and started repairing wagons for the neighbors. Clara grew into a quiet, thoughtful girl who followed Everett through the orchard, asking questions he never tired of answering. They added rooms to the house, built a new well, planted another row of peach trees. When they celebrated 20 years on the ranch, the neighbors came from all directions. They brought quilts, baskets, jars of preserves. Someone brought a fiddle, someone else a guitar. They danced beneath the stars, barefoot in the grass, while Clara read aloud a story she'd written about a man who fell from a train and into a life he didn't expect. Anna sat beside Everett, her hand in his. "You built something," she said. "So did you." "It's ours." He nodded. "And it'll last." In the orchard, the wind stirred the trees, scattering petals over the earth that had once been too dry to yield anything at all. Now it bloomed with memory, with promise, with love rooted so deep nothing could ever tear it out. When Everett passed, it was spring again. The peach trees were just beginning to bloom, pink and soft against a sky that promised rain. He died quietly in the early morning hours, with Anna's hand in his, and the window open beside the bed. Clara had sat with him through the night, reading aloud from the journal he'd started for her years ago, entries about fence posts and frost, about his first time holding her, about the way her mother laughed when no one else was around. He didn't speak in those last hours, but his breathing was easy, his brow smooth. Anna whispered into his ear as the sky lightened, telling him all the things they'd built, all the ways he'd changed their lives. She didn't cry, not then. She just held on until his hand went still in hers. Henry carved the coffin from cedar, plain and beautiful. Emily came home and dug into the hard soil beside Jacob's grave. The two men laid under the cottonwood, with space still between them for Anna. Clara wrote the inscription for Everett's stone. Everett Bishop. He stayed. And we are better for it. The neighbors came, dozens, some from as far as Missouri. They filled the orchard and the house and the porch, carrying stories, food, hugs that lingered too long. They wept when they spoke of him. They laughed through tears. They stayed late into the night, and when they left, they promised to return every spring, just to see the trees bloom. Anna sat by the hearth that evening, the fire low, the house quiet except for the ticking of Everett's old watch, which now hung on a hook by the door. Clara brought her a cup of tea and sat beside her. "Do you miss him?" she asked softly. Anna looked into the fire. Every breath. Clara took her hand. "Will you be all right?" Anna turned to her daughter, the child who had toddled through the peach trees and now stood with her mother's strength in her spine and her father's patience in her eyes. "I'll always miss him," she said, "but we carry him in this house, in the trees, in every sunrise over that ridge." She reached for the journal Clara had brought in from the porch, the one Everett had written in. She opened it and flipped through the pages. Every word was his voice. She found the final entry, written just days before. "If love is a railroad, then it isn't built in haste. It's laid track by track, mile by mile, nail by nail. I used to think power came from owning the train, but now I know it comes from choosing where it goes. And I chose here. I chose them. I chose her. And I would do it again, even if I had only 1 mile left to ride." Anna closed the book gently and held it to her chest. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. A few petals fell across the porch, and somewhere in the orchard a new bloom opened, soft, steady, forever. Years later, Clara stood beneath the cottonwood with her own daughter asleep in her arms. The breeze smelled like peach blossoms and rain-soaked earth, and the orchard behind her was thick with green. She wore her father's coat. It still fit her across the shoulders, and her boots were caked with mud from the far pasture where she'd spent the morning checking the new calves. The ranch had grown since Everett's time, but the heart of it remained the same. The house still stood where Anna had built it back up from sorrow. The barn doors still opened to the same wide fields. The beam inside still bore the names carved with care. Clara ran her hand over Everett's, over Anna's, and her fingers trembled when she added her daughter's name beneath them with a small carving knife her brother Henry had passed down to her. Then she sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over the wheat, her baby nestled close, the same peach trees lining the horizon that once caught her mother's laughter and her father's stories. Emily still visited from the city every month, bringing books and dried flowers and stories of the world beyond the ranch. Henry lived just past the East Ridge now, with a family of his own and a work shed full of carvings no one could buy because he refused to sell a single one. They came every Sunday, bringing bread and honey and sitting on the steps like they had when they were children, legs swinging, voices quiet with the peace that time grants only to those who've earned it. The railroad had long since passed them by, but the house never emptied. The fences never leaned too long, and the fields never lacked for someone who knew how to plant and how to wait. One night Clara opened the old ledger, the one Everett had kept. Inside were pages of numbers, of rainfall charts and hatch counts. But near the back she found something she had forgotten, a letter. To her. He had written it in the final year of his life, folded it between the pages where only she would look. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. "You were my harvest, Clara, my second spring. You taught me how to stay when staying was hard, how to hope when I didn't believe I deserved more. You and your mother and that house built me into a man I hadn't known I could be. If you're reading this, it means you're still here, still tending, still building. I'm proud of you. I love you. Keep going." She wept there by lamplight, quiet tears that slid into the folds of the old leather cover. Then she folded the letter back inside. She stood, and she returned to the window where her daughter had begun to stir in her crib, and where the wind lifted the curtains and carried the scent of blossoms through the home her father had rebuilt from the ground up, one truth at a time. And in every corner of that home, in the wood, in the stone, in the soil, he remained. Every spring, on the first warm morning when the peach blossoms began to unfurl, Clara gathered her daughter, now old enough to walk the orchard paths herself, and led her down to the cottonwood tree. The grass beneath it grew thick and soft, and 2 headstones stood there side by side, weathered by rain and sun and time. Flowers bloomed around their bases, wild primrose, lavender, Anna's favorite poppies, and a small bench sat beneath the tree's low-hanging limbs. Clara knelt in the grass and traced the names with her fingertips. Anna Thatcher Bishop, Everett Bishop. The girl beside her, bright-eyed and curious, looked up. "Tell me again," she said. So Clara told her. She told her of a woman who buried her first husband in grief, but kept the land alive with grit and prayer. She told her of a man who came from money and machines, who was broken and bleeding when he crawled onto her land, thinking it was his last stop. She told her how he healed there, not just in body but in heart, how he stayed, how he held a crying boy in his arms and fixed fences with his bare hands and taught a little girl how to count stars, how he fell in love not with a house but with a home. She told her daughter how he traded steel and profit for soil and promise, how he carved a name not into contracts but into wood and children's hearts. When Clara finished, her daughter leaned against her side and whispered, "That's why you stayed too." Clara nodded. It's where everything good started. They sat on the bench in silence. The wind moved gently through the trees and petals fell around them like blessings. That night, back in the house Everett had helped rebuild, Clara opened the old journal again. Her daughter had fallen asleep beside her, a sketchbook open across her lap filled with drawings of trees and horses and the outline of 2 hands holding each other. Clara wrote one final line at the bottom of the page. "He made our ranch a home, and home once made with love never fades." The lamplight flickered. The porch creaked, and outside in the orchard Everett planted, another bloom opened in the night. When Clara's daughter was grown, she took over the ranch with the same quiet determination that had once lived in her grandmother's eyes. She kept the house painted, the orchard pruned, the fences mended. She read from the same weathered journal every winter, just as her mother had, and every spring she brought out the little stool and told her children the story beneath the cottonwood. She told them about Anna and Everett, about how kindness had opened a door and how a man with nothing left but a name had walked through and found everything he didn't know he'd been missing. She spoke of the droughts, the freezes, the hard years and the better ones, of laughter echoing through the halls, of fresh bread pulled from the oven, of babies swaddled in quilts, sewn from scraps of old shirts and memory. The porch swing was older now, but it still creaked in the same rhythm, and the bench under the peach trees had been repaired 3 times, but never moved. The peach trees, the ones Everett had planted in the early years, still bloomed every spring, and their fruit filled the kitchen with the scent of sugar and sun each August. On Clara's last day she asked to be brought to the orchard. The family carried her gently on a quilt that had once belonged to Anna. They laid her beneath the cottonwood where the breeze smelled like rain and the grass was cool beneath her fingers. She reached out and touched the stones one last time, then looked up at her daughter, her hands so much like Anna's, her posture so much like Everett's. "You tell them," she whispered. "You keep telling them." And her daughter nodded, pressing their foreheads together. "I will." When Clara was buried between her mother and father, the orchard was quiet, except for the rustle of branches and the birdsong overhead. The whole town came, even strangers who'd only heard the stories second-hand. They filled the rows between the trees and sang songs without instruments. Afterward, they passed around slices of warm peach pie and stood in circles, telling each other what the bishops had meant to them. That night, the youngest of Clara's grandchildren stood in the hallway of the house, staring up at the framed piece of Everett's handwriting that had hung there for generations. "Stay," it said only that. The child read it aloud in a whisper, then took her mother's hand and walked out onto the porch where the orchard waited, the trees full of the same blossoms that had first opened when a man fell from the sky, and a widow chose to open her door. And so the story continued, quietly, steadily, forever. That winter, the first without Clara, the orchard slept under a thick blanket of snow. The peach trees, their branches bare and slick with frost, cast long shadows across the yard. Inside the house, the hearth still glowed with the same gentle fire that had warmed generations. Clara's daughter, Elise, sat at the table with her own 2 children, their cheeks pink from the cold, their fingers curled around chipped mugs of warm cider. They'd asked about the journal that night, the one wrapped in cloth and tied with a faded ribbon tucked into the cedar chest beside the window. Elise had brought it out carefully, her hands reverent, as if the leather-bound pages were sacred scripture. And in a way, they were. She turned to a passage dated September 15th, 1899. Everett's handwriting, slow and deliberate, filled the page. Anna laughed today, not just smiled or chuckled, she laughed. That deep, unrestrained sound that makes your chest ache for how long it's been missing. The sound that says hope has taken root again. It echoed through the orchard while she chased Clara between the rows. I nearly fell to my knees hearing it. Elise read the words aloud, her voice low, steady. Her daughter leaned against her side, her son sitting cross-legged on the floor, his brow furrowed with the serious thought of a child trying to understand grown-up grief. "They loved each other?" he asked softly, eyes on the curling edge of the page. "They did," Elise said. "They didn't plan it. It wasn't easy. But they loved each other through every broken thing they carried. And because of that, we're here." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. The orchard would bloom again, they knew. It always did. But before that spring came, there was one more story left to unfold. One not written in the journal, one passed only from voice to voice, memory to memory. It began in early January, when the road to town was still impassable, and the wind had carved deep hollows into the hills. The barn roof had buckled under the weight of snow, and Elise had sent word for help through the miller boy, who knew how to navigate the drifts with his father's old sleigh. She hadn't expected anyone to arrive before the next thaw, but 3 days later a single rider appeared at the edge of the orchard, bundled in a heavy duster and leading a pack mule behind him. He was tall, hunched from the wind, and when he dismounted and approached, Elise recognized him immediately, though she hadn't seen him in more than 20 years. Samuel Harper. He had been one of the orphans Everett took in after the war, a boy with coal-black eyes and the kind of silence that used to scare people until they realized he was simply listening to the world more closely than the rest of them. "Elise Bishop," he said, doffing his hat, his beard thick with ice. "Heard you might need a roof raised." Elise smiled, though her throat tightened. "You heard right." He stayed 3 weeks, sleeping in the bunkhouse, working from dawn until the firelight flickered in the windows. The children adored him immediately. He carved whistles for them from applewood and showed them how to whistle with 2 fingers and a curled tongue. He spoke sparingly but smiled often. On the last day, with the barn standing solid again and the snow beginning to melt, he handed Elise a folded letter wrapped in oilskin. "Your mama gave me this before she passed. Said not to give it to anyone else, said you'd know when it was time. Elise opened it that night after the children were asleep. Her mother's handwriting was shakier than usual, but the words were unmistakably hers. If you're reading this, then you've taken up what I never could quite finish. Not the orchard, not the ranch, but the story, the living one, the one in the marrow of our bones. Tell them the truth, Elise, all of it. Tell them Everett never stopped waking up early just to watch Anna make coffee, that he sang when he thought no one was listening, that he planted those peach trees not just for the fruit, but because she once said the blossoms looked like hope itself. And tell them this, too, the only thing that ever saved us was love, not the kind you find in stories, but the kind that shows up in the middle of a storm and refuses to leave. You come from that kind of love. Don't forget it. Don't let them forget it either. The letter ended with a simple sketch of a peach blossom. No signature, none needed. Elise folded the letter and placed it inside the journal right next to Everett's last entry, written the night before he passed. If I could live 1,000 lives, I'd ask for only one, with her, in this house, under these trees, with the sound of her laughter in the orchard and the children asleep beneath our roof. Let the world forget me. Let history write other names. I was here, and I loved them. Spring arrived slow that year, cautious and late. But when it came all at once. The orchard burst into bloom, branches heavy with pink and white. The bees returned, the creek ran fat with meltwater, and Elise, standing on the porch with her children, felt her mother's presence in every blade of grass, every blossom, every echo of wind through the eaves. She told them about the night Everett had almost died, how Anna had carried him in with frost-bitten fingers and a heart that still hadn't healed from her husband's betrayal, how he'd bled on their floor, how he'd cried out in his sleep for men who didn't come home, how her mother had nursed him not because she wanted to save a soldier, but because she couldn't turn her back on someone broken. Did she love him right away? Her daughter asked. No, Elise said. She fed him. She cleaned his wounds. She prayed he'd leave so she wouldn't have to risk her heart again. But he stayed. And one morning she caught him teaching Clara how to braid twine, and her hands started shaking. Why? Her son asked. Because that's when she knew, Elise whispered, that love had snuck in through the back door, wrapped itself around her children, and was now looking at her with quiet blue eyes that said, I'll never leave. The boy nodded solemnly. The girl wiped her nose with her sleeve. They didn't need more explanation. That evening, Elise opened the cedar chest and pulled out the old rifle, the one Everett had cleaned every Sunday until his hands grew too shaky. She handed it to her son. You're old enough to learn now, she said. The boy took it, awe in his eyes, and thus the teaching began again. By summer, the children could mend fences, tell the weather by the shape of clouds, and recite the journal's most quoted lines by heart. They knew how to saddle a horse, how to pick a ripe peach, how to gut a fish without flinching. They knew their mother's laugh and their father's quiet hum. And one afternoon, while helping Samuel Harper load lumber, the girl turned to him and asked, Did Everett ever teach you how to fight? Samuel grinned. He taught me how to protect. She nodded, thoughtful. Good. That's what I want to learn. Years later, when the orchard stretched wider than ever before, when the ranch employed half the town and fed the other half, when the Bishop name had become a promise rather than a legacy, Elise would walk among the rows of trees with her grandchildren and tell them about a war that stole men, a woman abandoned, and a soldier found in the snow. She'd tell them about the porch swing, the pocket watch, the wedding that happened beneath the cottonwood when the first blossoms opened. She'd tell them about Clara, about the storm, about how love doesn't always come with fanfare but often arrives looking like hard work and second chances. And always, when she ended the tale, she'd take their small hands in hers, point to the sign at the gate that read, The Morning Orchard, and say, This is what love built. Because it was true. It had built the fences and the barn and the home. It had built the children and the traditions and the stories passed from voice to voice. It had built her. It had built them all. And as long as the trees bloomed, the story would go on. Elise didn't know she was pregnant until the end of that long, hot summer. She'd noticed the signs, the way fatigue settled in her bones like stone, the nausea that came with the smell of frying pork, the strange, inexplicable dreams. But she'd dismissed it at first. It had been years since she thought of herself as a woman who might still carry life. She'd buried that hope not long after Clara passed. But one morning, while peeling apples in the kitchen, she felt the flutter, small and light, like the brush of a moth's wings from the inside. Her hands froze mid-motion. She pressed her fingers to her belly, breath caught in her throat. She whispered, "No," not in fear, but in reverence. And then again, "Yes." Her children noticed before she said a word. Her daughter, the older of the two, watched her carefully over the next few days, asking if she was tired, if she needed help lifting the heavy flour sacks, if she should be riding less. And then, one night, her son climbed up beside her on the porch swing and rested his head against her shoulder. "I heard you talking to the baby this morning." Elise didn't ask how. She just smiled. "I suppose I was." "Is it going to be like when you had us?" "I don't know," she said, "but I think it will be just as special." He nodded solemnly, then patted her stomach gently. "Don't worry, little one. You've got the best big brother in the county." When she told Samuel, he wept, not with fear or shame, but with the wonder of a man who never thought he'd be given another beginning. He dropped to one knee in the dirt beside the orchard, cradled her hands and whispered, "I won't let you carry this alone." And he didn't. That autumn, the orchard bore a record harvest. Barrels of peaches were stacked high in the barn. They baked pies and jarred preserves and sent baskets to every family in the county. The children made signs that read "Love in every bite" and painted hearts on the crates. They didn't say why. But somehow everyone in town understood. That winter snow fell so thick the porch railings vanished beneath it. Elise's belly rounded like the moon. The baby kicked constantly, strong and steady. Her daughter began reading to her belly each night, and her son carved a rattle out of walnut wood, carefully etching initials onto its handle, even though they hadn't chosen a name yet. The baby came in March. A storm rolled in with her labor. Lightning split the sky, as if the world were cracking open to let something new in. Elise's screams echoed through the hallways of the old house, and her daughter sat by her side, face pale but unshaken, feeding her spoonfuls of honey between contractions. Samuel caught the baby just before sunrise, his hands trembling with reverence. A girl, red-faced and furious, squalling as if to let the whole ranch know she had arrived. They named her Anna Bishop, after the woman who'd opened the door to a dying soldier, after the girl who braided twine under the cottonwood and laughed with dandelions in her hair, after the baby whose birth had rewritten the story of the Bishop orchard forever. She grew quickly, curious, willful, full of questions no one could answer fast enough. By the time she could toddle through the kitchen, she'd memorized the location of the old journal and often pointed to it, demanding a story from the old pages. By the time she could ride a pony, she was racing her siblings across the pasture like she'd been born in the saddle. And when her mother told her the story of the widow, the soldier, the blood on the floorboards, and the first peach blossoms, Anna Clara listened like she was hearing the memory of her own bones. It was in her, just like it was in all of them. The orchard was more than land, the home more than timber. It was a living memory, carried forward in each jar of jam, each hand-carved toy, each quiet promise spoken over a cradle. Time passed, as it always does, and with it came changes. Samuel's hair grayed. Elise's joints stiffened. The children grew taller, louder, bolder. But the heartbeat of the place never changed, and one day, when Elise was older than her mother had ever been, she sat beneath the cottonwood with Anna Clara beside her, now grown and beautiful and wise in the way women get when they've known love and sorrow in equal measure. "They'll ask one day," Elise said, nodding to the orchard. "Who?" "The children, the great-grandchildren, strangers, historians maybe, people who don't remember a time before this place stood tall and proud." Anna Clara's eyes shone. "And what should I tell them?" Elise reached into the pocket of her apron and withdrew a folded letter. Her handwriting was smaller now, shakier, but still sure. "Start here." She pressed the paper into her daughter's hand. Anna Clara unfolded it and began to read. "Once there was a widow with nothing left but a leaky roof and 2 babies to feed. She didn't ask for a miracle, but she got one anyway. Bloodied and broken and delivered by a snowstorm, she gave what little she had: warmth, herbs, soup, faith. And he gave everything in return: safety, hope, love. That is how our story began." The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting golden light across the orchard. Anna Clara folded the letter and tucked it against her chest. "I'll tell them," she whispered. And she did. Every year when the blossoms bloomed, she brought out the journal and read from the old pages. She taught children to braid twine and mend fences. She baked pies with her sleeves rolled up and sang songs as the peaches boiled on the stove. She married a school teacher with gentle hands. They raised 4 children in the same house, under the same beams Everett once repaired. And when the time came, she passed the journal on, because that was the promise, that the story would never die, that it would live not just in the pages of a book, but in the hands of those who kept planting, building, healing, loving, that it would outlive wars and storms and sorrow, that it would last as long as the orchard bloomed, forever. Anna Clara's youngest, Ruth, was the first to ask the question her mother had once asked her grandmother: "Did they ever stop being afraid?" It was evening, and the porch was washed in the blue light of twilight. Ruth sat curled beside her mother on the old swing, her bare feet tucked under her skirt, the soft thrum of crickets humming beneath the silence. Anna Clara looked out across the orchard. The trees swayed gently, their branches still heavy with late summer fruit. "No," she said after a long pause, "they just learned to live with the fear, and to love in spite of it." Ruth's brow furrowed the way Anna Clara remembered her own doing at that age. "That doesn't sound very comforting." "It isn't," she admitted, "but it's true. And sometimes the truth isn't a comfort. It's a foundation." Ruth turned that over for a while, watching a bat dip low across the yard. "But they were happy?" "They were," Anna Clara said, smiling, "because they chose to be. Because even when the world gave them 1,000 reasons not to trust again, not to build again, not to love again, they did anyway." And Ruth, being 12 and wise beyond her years, nodded as if she understood. The next day she asked to see the journal. She read for hours, curled in the sunlit corner of the kitchen, turning each page with care, lips moving silently over the words. And when she was done, she didn't ask more questions. She simply took the old journal and began copying it into a fresh one, her own handwriting looping like vines across the blank pages. "This one's for the schoolhouse," she explained to her mother, "so the other kids know too." And just like that, the story was told again, passed from one hand to the next, never fading, always growing. The orchard weathered another drought that year. The river dropped low, the fields crackled and turned to dust, but the trees, though thinner, still bloomed, and the family, though tired, still gathered. They filled buckets with what fruit they could. They repaired the chicken coop when a fox tore through it. They wrapped their arms around each other in the heat of sleepless nights and said, "We're still here," because that mattered, because that was part of the legacy. Anna Clara lost her husband the next spring, a fever that came fast and cruel. Ruth sat with him while he faded, reading from the journal in a voice that never shook. When the last breath left his chest, she closed the book, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "I'll take care of them now." And she did. She was 17 when she took over the land's full care. Her brothers helped with the cattle, her cousins with the harvest. But it was Ruth who walked the fence lines each morning, her boots dusted with dew, her shadow long and sure against the grass. She never left the ranch, not because she couldn't, but because she wouldn't. She once told a suitor who tried to convince her to see the world that the orchard was the only world she needed, that everything worth learning was written in the bark of trees and the pages of old journals and the lines on her mother's face. He didn't understand. So she let him go. Years later, when the Bishop family name was etched into county records as one of the founding ranches of the region, people still came by to see the orchard. They came in spring to see the blossoms. They came in autumn to taste the peaches. But most of all, they came to hear the story. And Ruth told it, not with grandeur, but with reverence. She told them about Anna Clara and Elise, about Samuel and Everett, about the night a dying soldier changed everything, about how love wasn't a lightning strike but a slow burn, how it needed tending like any fire, how it could flicker and crackle and nearly die. But if you fed it, if you guarded it, it could survive anything. She spoke of sacrifice, of faith, of laughter in the orchard and blood on the floorboards, of how kindness had made a place bloom where only grief had grown before. And always at the end she would point to the gate, the one still carved with Everett's shaky script. Stay. It was a command, a promise, a prayer, and they had honored it, even when it hurt, even when it meant holding grief like a baby in your arms and rocking it until it quieted. They had stayed, and because of that, the story had lived, and it would live again, in the next child who asked, in the next pie baked, in the next storm weathered as a family, forever. When Ruth was well into her 40s, her hair streaked with gray like a river of wisdom through the night-dark strands, a woman came up the path to the orchard one April morning, holding a satchel in one hand and a folded telegram in the other. Her boots were worn smooth at the heel, her coat patched at the elbows, and though her face was young, her eyes were too old to match it. She introduced herself as Lucy Prescott, and she said she was looking for the Bishop family. Ruth stood on the porch, arms crossed lightly over her apron, watching the woman like one might study a sudden change in wind. "You found us." Lucy nodded. I think I might be one of you." She explained that her grandmother had once been sent away from a boarding school in Kansas with a name she never spoke again, Clara Bishop. The dates lined up, so did the places. And when Lucy unfolded the telegram, Ruth saw the Bishop postmark, the signature of a woman she'd only heard stories about. Clara's handwriting, unmistakable. A single line written to a headmistress. "She is my daughter's daughter. Keep her safe." Ruth invited Lucy inside, and they sat in the parlor with the journal open between them. When Ruth reached the part where Everett carved the cradle for Clara, Lucy reached out and traced the edge of the page with a trembling hand. "I think I've always known," she whispered. "Not the names, but the feeling. Like I came from something warm and rooted, even if no one told me." Ruth watched her carefully. "Would you like to stay?" Lucy nodded slowly, eyes bright with tears. "I would." And so she did. She moved into the east bedroom, the one with the wide window that looked out over the orchard. She took to the land as though it were written in her blood. By summer she could ride as well as Ruth, handle a horse's temperament like a whisper. She made cider from windfall apples and wove baskets with the youngest of the Bishop cousins. And one afternoon, while pruning the peach trees, she found a splintered plaque buried beneath the roots of the oldest tree. The name Everett Bishop was barely visible through the moss and weathering. She carried it inside, and Ruth took it in her hands like a relic. "I thought it was lost," she murmured. "He put this here himself," said the first tree needed to remember the man who planted it. Together they cleaned it, restored it, and mounted it at the center of the orchard. Beneath his name they carved another line. "Let it be known he planted more than fruit here. He planted legacy, love, and the roots of a family stronger than sorrow." That fall the orchard's yield doubled. No one could explain it. Lucy said it was the land remembering its purpose. Ruth said it was the family coming back together. They baked pies until their hands ached and shipped preserves as far as Chicago. People sent letters asking for the recipe. Others came in person to ask for something harder to describe. A glimpse of the peace they'd heard lived in the soil here. "Is it true?" a woman from Baltimore asked one afternoon, standing just outside the fence line, her baby fussing on her hip, "that a widow took in a broken man and they built a life here?" Ruth didn't answer at first. She just nodded toward the orchard, where the branches were thick with fruit, and the breeze carried the scent of sweetness and wood smoke. "Yes," she said at last, "it's all true, every word of it." And she invited the woman in, because that's what they did. They invited people in. Not just into the home, but into the story. The journal had been copied now into more than a dozen hands, each with its own handwriting, its own marginalia, its own pressed flowers and notes in the edges. It was a living book, a breathing one, and every child born on the ranch learned the first line before they could walk. Once there was a woman who opened her door to a dying soldier. By the time Ruth passed, peaceful in her sleep beneath the very quilt Anna had once sewn from leftover calico and prayer, Lucy was the one who stood beside the cottonwood with the newest journal open in her hands. She read aloud while the family gathered, the orchard quiet in mourning. She spoke of blood on snow, of whispered promises, of a love so stubborn it took root where no one thought life could grow. She read Everett's words, Anna's, Clara's, Elise's, Ruth's, and then she turned the page to her own handwriting, neat and careful. And now I carry it. This name, this place, this legacy, built by women who chose to stay, to mend, to forgive, to grow. We are not made strong by accident. We are forged in fire and patience and acts of ordinary mercy. The Bishop family lives because a stranger was not turned away, because a child braided twine with hands that remembered their father, because a soldier laid down his pride and picked up a child instead of a rifle. We live because love was not just spoken, but lived. She closed the book, and the family stood silent, heads bowed. Then a baby cried, the newest bishop just a week old. And the silence broke into laughter and weeping, and arms wrapped around each other like vines around a strong post. Later, they buried Ruth beside the others, Anna, Everett, Elise, and planted another peach tree at her feet. By spring, it had blossoms. Of course it did, because the story always bloomed again, even after loss, even after silence, even after everything else had faded. It was the soil, the roots, the love that never stopped choosing to stay. The child born that spring was named Everett James Bishop. They called him E.J. He had a quietness about him, like his namesake, thoughtful, steady. By the time he was 5, he knew how to tie a slip knot, split kindling with a hatchet under supervision, and comfort a crying calf with his hand flat against its brow. He followed Lucy everywhere. If she was mending a fence, he was handing her nails. If she was teaching the younger children how to tell a peach by its weight, he was beside her, tasting each one and nodding solemnly. If she was in the orchard late, standing beneath the tree where Ruth's stone rested, he'd come quietly and take her hand without asking why. One July afternoon, Lucy found him sitting cross-legged in the shade of the oldest peach tree, a page torn from a notebook in his lap, his brow furrowed. "You writing?" she asked, lowering herself beside him. "Trying," he said, frustrated. "I don't know how to say it right." "Say what?" He held up the paper. In his uneven handwriting were the words, "Once there was a man who got lost, but found a family." "That's good," Lucy said gently. "That's real good." "I want to write the part they don't talk about," he said. "The parts after, when things get quiet again, when it's just hard work and not being sure if the barn roof will hold. That part matters too, right?" "It matters the most," she whispered. They didn't speak much after that, just sat in the orchard while the bees moved slow and heavy through the blossoms and the sun turned gold above them. Years later, when E.J. was grown and known throughout the county as the kind of man who could fix anything, from a broken plow to a wounded heart, he'd still carry that piece of paper folded in his wallet. And every time he walked past the place where the journal was kept, now housed in a glass case near the hearth, he'd touch it gently, as if to say, "I remember. I still believe." By then the orchard had doubled in size again. The family had built a small schoolhouse on the edge of the property, and a guest cabin for visitors who needed rest, healing, quiet. They called it the Second Chance House, and inside it hung a single framed line, written in Everett's faded script. Every man should get to hear a child's laughter in the place he thought he'd die. Veterans came. Widows came. Young couples trying to remember why they'd fallen in love in the first place came. Some stayed only a night. Some stayed forever. No one was ever turned away. And every Sunday morning, without fail, Lucy would stand in front of the porch swing, open the journal to a different page, and read. Sometimes it was Anna's entry about the first spring Everett danced with her in the kitchen, even though his leg was still healing and he tripped over the rug twice. Sometimes it was Clara's poem about the way the orchard smelled in September, like promises kept. Other times it was Elisa's note from the morning. She realized her children no longer cried for their father, not because they'd forgotten, but because they finally felt safe. No matter which page she read, the family listened. Even E.J., even when he had fencing to do or paperwork stacked high on his desk, would sit on the step and let the words settle into his bones like gospel. One Sunday Lucy didn't read. She stood silently with the journal pressed to her chest and simply looked at them, every child, every adult, every visitor who had somehow become part of this great web. Then she passed the book to E.J. "It's your turn." He swallowed hard, took the journal, opened to a blank page, and read aloud what he had written the night before, under lamplight, after helping birth a stubborn colt in the far field. "I used to think this place was built by trees and earth, but it's not. It's built by choices, by hands that stayed instead of leaving, by hearts that forgave instead of folding in on themselves, by people who looked at blood on the floor and still saw a future. I don't know how many more generations this orchard will see, but I know this. We'll keep telling the story, because every time we do, we're planting something stronger than peaches. We're planting the kind of roots that keep a soul from drifting." He closed the book. Silence settled for a moment. Then someone began to clap, slowly, reverently. And before long the orchard rang with the sound of applause, not for performance, but for memory, for what had come before and what would come next. Later that day, a new visitor arrived, a young woman, ragged at the edges, carrying a letter from her grandmother, who had once stayed in the Second Chance House decades ago. She said she didn't know what she was looking for, just that she'd woken one day and realized she needed to stand beneath the trees that had once saved her bloodline. E.J. offered her coffee, a place to sit. Then, without preamble, he said, "You're welcome to stay. No questions asked." She cried then, quietly, and stayed for a week, then a month. Then she never left, because that's how it always went. Some were born into the family, some walked into it by chance. All of them belonged. And still every spring the orchard bloomed, every fall it bent with fruit. Every winter the wind howled but never cracked the foundation, because it wasn't built of wood and nail. It was built of staying. And staying, after all, is just another word for love. Winter came early the year E.J. turned 50. The first snow fell in late October, blanketing the orchard in a soft hush that made even the children quiet. The trees, half harvested and rimmed with frost, looked like ghosts of themselves, their limbs raised like arms frozen mid-prayer. Inside the house the fire was already burning before the sun rose. E.J. sat at the kitchen table in the same chair his great-great-grandfather had once used to write his final journal entry. He still carved the date into the edge of his notebook every morning, even if some days he only had a single sentence to offer. This morning he wrote, "The frost came heavy, but the trees held." He stared at the words for a long time before nodding once and setting the pencil down. Outside, Ruthie, his eldest daughter, named after the aunt who had once read the journal aloud beneath the cottonwood, was trying to convince her younger brothers to wear scarves. They groaned and argued and made faces, but they wore them anyway, knowing the look she'd give if they didn't. E.J. watched through the window with a soft smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. The porch still bore the grooves from Clara's footsteps. The railing was new, the shingles were newer, but the bones of the place had not changed. They had never dared change the swing. He stood, joints creaking in the familiar way they did now, and reached for the coat that had once belonged to his grandfather. The fabric was worn but strong, patches of leather added over the years by hands that had loved it as much as the land itself. He stepped out into the crisp morning air, boots crunching lightly over the new snow. Ruthie saw him first. "You're up early," she called, pushing a strand of hair from her face. She wore her mother's eyes, though she didn't know it. "Old bones don't sleep," he replied, the words warm in his mouth. The boys ran ahead, chasing each other toward the barn. One of them had tied a red ribbon around the neck of their dog, and it bobbed along like a cheerful banner. "Any dreams?" Ruthie asked, falling into step beside him. "Only the usual. Snow, trees, my father saying not to let the frost bite the pipes." She grinned. "Sounds like him." He turned to look at her, the wind tugging at her coat. "You've been thinking about leaving." Her smile faltered. "It's not wrong," he said gently. "You wouldn't be the first." She looked at him, eyes brimming. "I love it here, I do, but there's a part of me that keeps wondering what else is out there." He nodded. "Then go find out. The orchard will be here when you come back. It always is." She pressed her face to his chest like she did when she was small and scared of thunderstorms. And then, the next week, she left. She packed her bags with the journal's first copy tucked into the side pocket and a letter from E.J. folded into the spine. She promised to write. She promised to return. E.J. stood by the cottonwood long after the wagon disappeared down the road. He remembered watching his own mother ride off to town the first time, her scarf trailing in the breeze, her hand raised in goodbye. It hurt, yes. But it was the kind of hurt that proved a story still had somewhere left to go. That winter was the hardest in 20 years. Blizzards stacked like freight cars across the plains. The wind was vicious, the cold mean. They lost a calf. A corner of the barn collapsed under ice. The power went out for 3 days straight, but no one despaired, because they'd been here before. They had the woodpile stocked and the candles tall and ready. They had hands to mend the cracks and shoulders to carry what cracked further. They sang while they worked, told stories while they waited for water to boil, made snow angels when the storm broke, because children will always find joy when adults allow them the space. And come March, when the thaw began, the trees responded. First with a shift in scent, then with tiny green specks nudging from the bark like newborn promises. By April, the orchard was alive again. E.J. walked its rows each morning, hand brushing over bark as if saying hello. He stopped at every grave, said a few words. Mostly thank yous. Ruthie returned in May. She wore boots caked with red clay and a jacket that smelled of salt air. Her eyes looked wider somehow, but steadier too. "I miss the quiet," she said, stepping down from the wagon. "And the pie," E.J. added, grinning. They laughed and cried all at once. That evening, she unpacked her satchel and added a new page to the journal. It wasn't written in long prose or florid lines, just a simple truth. You can go far and still belong here. You can travel oceans and still be rooted. You can stand anywhere on this earth and know who you are because someone once chose to stay. They held a dance that weekend. String lights looped between the trees. Fiddles sang into the night. Pies steamed on every table, and the children ran barefoot through the orchard, their laughter rising like music itself. E.J. danced with Ruthie, slow and proud, one hand on her shoulder, the other clutching hers like something sacred. He thought of Everett and Anna, of Samuel and Elise, of every couple who'd ever fallen in love beneath these boughs. When the music faded, he whispered, "You ready?" "For what?" she asked, and he smiled, pressed the journal into her arms. "To carry it now." She didn't cry, not yet, but her hands trembled as she nodded. They sat on the porch until long after everyone had gone, the fireflies blinking like old souls remembering. The journal rested on her lap, and she began to read, not aloud, not yet, but with her eyes closed, as if the words lived somewhere deeper than the page. The wind whispered through the trees, and the orchard listened, because the story was still being written, and love was still staying forever.